the 1980s, in a Sacramento boarding house, lived a sweet little old lady named Dorothea Puente. That is where she took care of her elderly and disabled tenants and was very much loved in the community. But she wasn't as old as she said she was. And nobody knew about the dark secret she kept buried right under her front lawn.
Nobody, no crime.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hey guys, it's Ryan. If you are joining me again, then I thank you because you are a real one. If this is your first time joining me, then again, thank you. I hope you stick to the whole thing because this is a doozy of a case, and I hope you hit the subscribe button and come back next time. For today's tea, I will be drinking Poe Me Some More, which is an Edgar Allan Poe themed tea, courtesy of my mama, because she knows how much I love Edgar Allan Poe, and it's a really cool theme for a tea. And not to mention, it tastes really good too. So I wanted to upload this video a little bit sooner, but we've had a bunch of events going on that were very fun, but very time consuming. So I'm just now getting to upload this. And speaking of my mama, she is the one that suggested this story for today. And I am very passionate about it. It is definitely a good one, very intriguing, just because it's not the usual kind of thing that you would see. But before we really dig into this case, a little bit punny, I want to start a little bit about talking about Dorothea's beginning before she became the landlady of the death house. I will say she had a very sad childhood. Like, it was not easy for her. And it does not by any means excuse anything that she did, because your past does not define you. It doesn't cause you to become a killer. But it doesn't mean that as a human, we can't feel bad for what she had to endure and what she went through, you know? So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and give you a little bit of history about where she started and what may have played a part. Again, not the whole thing, but played a part in who she became. Dorothea Puente was born January 9th, 1929 to parents Judy May and Jesse James Gray. She was originally born Dorothea Gray, and she resided in Redlands, California, and she was the sixth out of 7 children. As I said, her childhood was not very easy. Her parents were both drunks and very abusive, and they weren't doing very well financially, especially for having 7 children. And so eventually her mother ended up doing sex work to kind of bring in a little bit of extra money. But during that time, she would leave the kids at home alone with their dad, who really did not pay them very much attention. And it might be for the better, since he was very abusive. They were both very abusive. So it was a very rough childhood. Eventually, their dad ended up actually contracting tuberculosis, and he did die. The next year, her mother, she actually lost custody of the kids. And before she was able to regain custody that same year, she died in a motorcycle accident. It wasn't really a good turning point for her getting away from her parents, because after that she was sent to a care home or child services, and she was in an orphanage. And through that time, it is said that she was sexually abused, and she was split from her siblings and basically lost all form of communication to them. And it was very rough for her growing up. She obviously didn't have a lot, and it just wasn't an easy childhood. During that time, she actually began prostituting, and that is how she was making her money. And this continued until she met a man named Fred McTowell. And they married when she was 16 years old. And he was significantly older than her, so it's a little weird that he was interested in that. And he knew what she did. And I guess that just made him all the more interested. It was kind of a groomy situation, and to me, I think he was kind of But she did marry this man, and she actually had 2 children with him, 2 little girls. And the first she did not want to keep. She sent the child to live with a family member and continued her life until she had another little girl who she actually put up for adoption. Unfortunately, it was probably the best for the kid, even though it was, probably not easy, but it wasn't an easy choice for her, but it was definitely the right choice in this situation. After that, she did have another child, but she unfortunately miscarried that child. And after that, Fred left her, and that was the end of that marriage. And she did continue prostituting and, trying to make a living that way. She was eventually arrested because she was buying these bougie lingeries and pantyhose and all kinds of things above her means with forged checks. So she didn't have the money, but she was forging these checks to get the items that she wanted, and it did catch up with her, and she was arrested. When she was released on probation, and she didn't stick around very long. She waited maybe a year, and she left the area and moved to San Francisco. And that is where she married her next husband, Axel Johansson. She had this tendency all growing up of big lies. She would try and make herself sound more interesting than she was. She would tell these whoppers, and some people believed it, and that is one reason that she was very liked, because people just thought she was very interesting. When she married Axel, she actually told him that she was a Muslim and Egyptian descent and a bunch of just crazy things that just weren't true. He was a fisherman, and he was away for long periods of time. And during those periods of time, sometimes he would come back home and find her in bed with another man. And this was a constant thing. She had men coming in all the time while he was away. She was not very faithful. And she would also gamble away his money. So not only was she taking all his money, she was cheating on him. And it just was not a very happy marriage. So eventually, she started running a brothel when she decided the prostitution wasn't quite for her. I don't believe that her husband knew about what she was doing as far as this income. But eventually one day, while she was running this brothel, a cop went undercover trying to catch her and went there and she solicited him and was caught, and she was arrested. Because of this, her husband was obviously not happy, and he wanted her seen by a therapist. When she went to this therapist, they diagnosed her as a pathological liar, to no surprise to anybody. I mean, she would tell some whoppers, and they basically confirmed that she was a pathological liar. And shortly after that, he left her. He just said, enough's enough. I unfortunately can't do this with you, and he left. Her next husband was Roberto Puente. That's where she got the name Puente. And he was actually 20 years younger than her. And during this time, she actually stopped the sex work and I guess tried to make an honest living. He was actually 20 years younger than her, which I think is just crazy. That's a little much of a gap. And she stopped sex work. She was, actually staying with him for a decent amount of time, not too long. None of her relationships really lasted that long. And of course, eventually things started going south with this man as well. And he did end up divorcing her. But it wasn't finalized until a long time later. But after they divorced, she did decide she wanted to, since she was already out of the sex work industry, she wanted to start doing something a little bit different. And she decided she would like to open a boarding house and kind of, I guess you could say, give back. And so during this time that she was running this boarding house, she would do things for the community. She was pulling alcoholics off the street. She would do things for the at-risk youth. She was buying little things for them. What people thought she was doing admirable things. She was really doing things for the community, and this is where she's kind of confusing, honestly, because she was doing good things. And during this time, she actually met another man that for a short time lived in that boarding house named Pedro Montalvo. That did not last very long. He was also very much younger than her, and I'd say it probably lasted around a week, and he left. He just completely dipped and never saw her again. And so that was that. But she still had her boarding house. So she was running this boarding house, and the people that come in, some of them were disabled, some of them were a little bit older. She would help them apply for their benefits and help them get money that would really help them to live, except she was stealing those benefits whenever they would come in. So she was making money off of these tenants and stealing everything that came in, which I think is crazy considering all the good that she was doing, and yet she was also stealing from them. So it is a bit sad. I wish she didn't kind of work both sides, After she was found out for stealing benefits, because one of her tenants that she was taking the benefits from was arrested, but yet their benefit checks continued to get cashed, it led her to get caught. And so she was arrested again, and she saw another therapist, and during this time they actually said that she had schizophrenia. I don't know exactly in what ways they were able to figure this out. However, that is what she was diagnosed with at this time. I don't know how bad it was or what exactly was going on there, but she was diagnosed at that time. She was actually released, and she didn't have any jail time, but they did put her on a strict probation. Yet again, she stuck with the probation for a little bit, and she left. She was out of there. And so she moved back to Sacramento, where she began caring for families and elderlies, and she was trying to help out families. And she was hired at one point for a lady named Esther, and she seemed to do really well in this house for a long time until they started noticing things were going missing. And it took them, Esther was getting very sick on top of that. And out of nowhere, she was doing relatively well up until Dorothea came into their lives. And eventually they were able to put those pieces together. And so they obviously confronted her. They went to the police, but it didn't go anywhere because they had no proof that she had actually done anything. And after that, Esther did get better after they released Dorothea. And that was the end of that. She basically got away with whatever it was that she stole from Esther, and she had to find new targets. And so that's whenever she started hitting up bars, and she found a man named Malcolm McKenzie at a bar one night, and she drugged him and decided to take him home. I'm sure she probably gave him a nice story, like, hey, you want to come back to my place, or we'll go back to your place, and do what they do. And so of course he's like, yeah, we'll go. But at the time he didn't realize he had been drugged. So when he gets to the house, he's completely out of it, and she takes advantage of that. She steals everything in his home now that she is there, and she even stole the pinky ring off of his finger as he laid there. And that was actually his mother's ring, so I can imagine how he must feel about that. I mean, I would be so angry. I'm a very sentimental person, and that's just complete disrespect, stealing it right off his finger. And of course they had been talking the whole night. And so she had already, which I think is the stupidest thing, she had told him her name. So it's like she wanted to be caught. So of course he went to police whenever he was coherent enough to move around and get there. He went to the police and reported her, and she was arrested again. during this time, she was actually let out on bond and told that she had a case coming up that she would have to make, but she was free to do as she wanted at the moment. In April, she met a lady named Ruth Monroe. She was a 61-year-old mother of 5, and they kind of created a friendship. And around this time, Ruth's husband started becoming sick as well. And like I said, they had become very close. They actually had started up a restaurant together. Dorothea said she wanted to start a restaurant, and Ruth was on board, and they mainly funded it with Ruth's money. And they opened up this restaurant. And so they were also very close already when her husband started getting sick. And when her husband finally died, she didn't want to be alone. So Dorothea said, hey, like, why don't you come live with me in my boarding house, and it'll be a great life. And so she said, okay. So Ruth moved into the house, and her family did visit her very frequently. And at one point, her son actually came to visit and said that Ruth had a drink in her hand. She was very out of it. She wasn't acting like herself. She had a drink in her hand, and from what he said, it was very unusual for her to drink. She was not a drinker, wasn't her kind of thing. And so he asked her about it, like, hey, like, what's up with the drink? And he said, all she said was, oh, Dorothea made it for me to calm my nerves. So it's like, okay, like, fair, like, like, it can happen. So he left without really giving it much thought. Unfortunately, the next time he saw his mother, then she would be almost comatose, and she was laying in bed just staring at the wall. He tried to talk to her and got no response. She was completely not herself, and whenever he would ask her what was wrong, she wouldn't answer, but a tear slowly rolled down her cheek. And that just breaks my heart to know maybe she knew what was happening to her, and she was just too far gone to be able to say anything. She had apparently at other times told people, I feel so sick, I feel like I'm going to die, but she didn't know why. It was just a feeling, so people really didn't think too much of it. And eventually one night, and this was only 2 weeks after she moved in with Dorothea, one night, 2 weeks later, she died. They get a call in the morning and say, you need to get down here, your mother has passed away. And of course they rush down there, and their mother's gone. Dorothea says that she came in and she had killed herself. She had overdosed, and there was nothing else to be said. But her kids found this very suspicious because their mom was not that kind of woman. She was very happy. She had a lot going on. She had grandkids. She never mentioned anything. She was very much the type to be vocal. And she never mentioned anything about feeling down or depressed or any type of way. And it came on so suddenly. They just did not buy this. Like, they knew something wasn't right. And they asked the police to look into this further, and they were just denied. They were basically told it was a suicide. She took too many pills, and that's that. There's nothing else that can be done, and whatever. But they were very suspicious of it already, and they did not want to let it go, which I don't blame them, because they obviously loved their mother. She, took care of them alone. And it was 5 of them, and she did her very best. She worked so hard to get where she was in life, just to be taken out. So stupid. And she was such a sweet lady. And I can only imagine, like, it hurts me thinking if something like that were to happen to my mother and I knew that someone was behind it, I would stop at nothing. I would be so angry if the police would not listen to me. I don't know what I would do. Like, it's a horrible feeling just thinking about losing your mother in such a kind of way. But unfortunately, the police wouldn't listen, and it was what it was. It was shortly after this that Dorothea still had to deal with the court date that was set. Remember, she was just on probation. And of course, as she usually does, she decided to move. So she tried to flee to Mexico, where she met up with her friend, Dorothea Osborne. While she was with Dorothy, she drugged Dorothy and proceeded to try and steal all of her things. Dorothy thought at first that she had just fallen asleep, woke up to her things being missing, but obviously she knew who did it. I swear it's like she wanted to be caught. So Dorothy called the police and they found Dorothea, and she was brought back, and this time they weren't going to let her go. This time they wanted to make sure that she wasn't going to flee, she wasn't going to hurt anybody else, she was going to stay there. Of course, Ruth's family heard about her drugging Dorothea Osborne and stealing her possessions, and this made them even more suspicious. And so they went back to the police, wanted the case reopened, and unfortunately, although it was looked more into, they again said that it was a suicide and would not do anything else about it. And it's just kind of ridiculous. They already know that she's drugged somebody else. And this is a multiple occurring thing. She's drugged several people, but yet to them, this was not worth looking into. And that's just, it is what it is. But I feel like a lot of this could have been stopped a lot sooner had they looked more into Ruth's case. But again, without proof, there's also only so much that they could do. But it is just sad. So with her back in custody, then she had to sit there and earn her happy little butt and wait until trial. Well, after trial, she was actually told she had to stay in prison for 5 years, which is great. I wish she would have been in there longer, at least slowed her roll a little bit, well, you would think. But it really didn't teach her anything. She only served half of that time, and while she was in prison, she actually became very popular. Like I said, she was a huge liar, and so she told these whopper stories to the other inmates, and they loved her, honestly. They thought she was great. They thought she was so interesting. All these stories from the outside, and she's crazy awesome, right? So they loved her, and during that time, she actually had a pen pal that she was speaking to named Everson Gilmouth, and he was 77 years old. He had just lost his wife, and I guess was maybe looking for a friend or maybe more within the prison walls. He made contact with Dorothea, and he thought that, they just really hit it off. Personally, was pretty good on money. I think it had a little something more to do with that. But when she did get out of prison, again, only serving half her term, he was waiting for her, and he waited at, the area to pick her up, took her right home with all of his belongings as well, because he had told his family he was moving away and moving in with Dorothea, and that they would actually be married by that November. And he moved in, and that's whenever she decided, even though she actually was under strict rules, she could not own a boarding house or take care of any elderly or have anything to do with benefits. Because of the cases that she was already in trouble with, she wasn't supposed to be able to be near any of that. But she said screw that, even though she was on probation, which she got away with because they never checked on her, and she started another boarding house during this time. And during this time, Everson became very distant from his family. He wasn't talking to them as much as usual, which was very unlike him. They would call, she would pick up the phone, she maybe would have an excuse as to why he didn't want to talk. Eventually, they actually called the police because they knew this was not like their father. And so they called the police and they did a welfare check, and Everson was actually okay. And he got very angry at his family and said, never do that again. And after that, they obviously didn't. They didn't want to anger him if he really just didn't want to talk. And so they just kept hearing less and less and less from Everson. at one point, one of the family members had actually driven through and stopped to see him, but it was a very short visit and he was very out of it, very tired. Just again, not like himself, if that sounds familiar. And he was still very determined. He was going to be marrying Dorothea in November. But shortly after that, again, they didn't hear from him very often. They received a letter from Everson stating that the wedding was off and he basically was just going to head out and adventure and see other places, which again was very odd, but it was what it was. However, back at the boarding house, Dorothea had actually just hired a man named Ismael Flores to do some work on the floors in her home. And then after this, she asked him to build her a box. She had a bunch of books that she needed storing and, a place to put. And she asked him to do this, and if he did, she would give him Gilmouth's truck, his vehicle, and it'd be his, which is a little weird. Like, why are you giving away someone else's vehicle? But maybe she told him, he didn't need it anymore. So he was like, okay, cool. Like, I'll do the work for you. I could use a vehicle. And so he did the work. So he does the work to build a box, brings it to her, and a few days later, then he comes back, maybe to do some more work, and the box was nailed shut. She says, hey, can you help me go put these, or bring them to a storage area, maybe library storage, I don't know, and, just get rid of them. I don't need them in my house. And he's like, yeah, sure, I'll go help you. And so he starts driving. He obviously loads up this box. He said it was crazy heavy. And, the dimensions were about human-sized. So I almost kind of wonder, how did he not think of it? But, especially with the weight of it. But either way, he loads up this box, they start driving, and they're about maybe halfway to their destination, and she says, you know what? I changed my mind. Nobody's gonna want these books. They're just a bunch of old, crappy books. So if you wouldn't mind, let's just take them to the river and throw them in, because no one's gonna want them. It's a little weird because he says, sure, let's do that. So he goes to the river with Dorothea and helps her throw in this box, and they drive off. That's that. However, some fishermen sometime later find that box washed up on shore, and as they get close to it, it's not hard. They notice it's very coffin shaped. It has an odor penetrating it. And so they call the police, they open the box and find the remains of an older gentleman. Unfortunately, although it was Everson, they were not able to identify him for many years to come. And through this time, Dorothea is still writing Everson's family as him. And so they don't even know he's missing. They don't know anything is wrong. She would send them postcards and different things from him about his adventures. And so they didn't even know he was missing. They knew something was wrong, but not enough to think that he was dead. So he just remained as a John Doe for, I think, 3 years. And that is very sad. He just was unclaimed. At this point, Dorothea had already killed 2 people, and it was gonna become a lot easier for her. She started looking at the borders in her house a little differently. And by this time, her house was really coming along. She had a bunch of new tenants coming in, and she, from what I hear, actually did care for them fairly well. There's mixed opinions on that. Some people say that she was very sweet, would make sure they were bathed, taken care of, clean, dressed. She would even buy them small gifts. Other people say that she was very mean, and I think it probably did depend on who it was. So I kind of think both stories were true. I know a lot of them were drunks. A lot of them, they were elderly and disabled, and some of them were drunks. And for some reason, well, I say for some reason, but I think it probably does lead back to her parents. If someone had a drinking problem, she hated them. She treated them horribly, even, which is weird because she herself was a alcoholic. But it's different when it's yourself. But anyone else that had that problem within the house, she was a lot meaner to. So that's why I do kind of believe both stories. And she did come down harder on some people rather than others. But she did start having them sign over their checks. She would help them get the most out of their disability checks. And then she would have everybody within that house sign over her checks to her, or sign over their checks to her. And so she basically was the signer for all of them. And anyone who did not want to sign over their checks to her, it didn't matter. She would do it anyway because she would get to the mailbox before them and she would still end up with a good portion of their money. And so already she was resuming old habits of stealing their checks and their money. And she would give them a small portion to live on and say the rest was just expenses for living there. And against most of them were elderly and most of them were disabled, they didn't really think to argue for themselves. They kind of just let it happen. But she was raking in thousands a month. And for that time, that's a lot more than it is today. So she was making a lot of money on these checks. Again, she would give them or buy them things every now and again, but for how much money she was making and a lot of it being theirs, that's really not saying too much. One of these people that she decided she didn't need around anymore was Betty Palmer. One day she just didn't come back. She told all the tenants that asked that her daughter came to pick her up and that she wouldn't be living there anymore. But one day while she was out, her daughter came looking for Betty. And the tenants answered the door and said, no, she's not here. So later, when Dorothea came back, they asked her, you said that she went to go live with her daughter, but her daughter has no idea where she's at. Dorothea broke down and explained to them that she had actually gotten put into a care home by her, and she just didn't want to admit it or hurt the other tenants by letting them know that. She said that her health had gotten way too bad and that she had no choice but to do it. She felt awful for it. And so that is why she lied. And most of them just kind of believed it. They're like, well, that's sad to hear, but okay. And that was that. And so she continued along her way and continued doing the things that she was doing. Her next victim would be Leona Carpenter. And she was a 78-year-old woman. And while she was in the hospital, she actually had Dorothea come to the hospital where she signed over her power of attorney to her. And she was released back into Dorothea's care for a little bit. She went back to the hospital and because she was sick again and it was a repeating occurrence, and eventually ended back up with Dorothea again. And I mean, it was like a back and forth where she was fixing to die at the hospital, but then she'd get better miraculously and go back there. And they just kept sending her back. And so eventually one day she just stopped coming to the hospital. She disappeared. No one heard from her again. And no one really knew what happened. I don't know if they assumed she got better, but no one ever heard from her again. Dorothea would often go to the bar and look for new tenants and kind of give them, the rundown and like, hey, like I can take care of you. I have everything you need here. I have nurses coming in, everything to make her look as good as possible. Well, one day she was at the bar and she met a man named James Gallup. He was 62 years old and he had been diagnosed with a tumor. So she said, hey, it would be best if you came and lived with me and I can take care of you while you were getting treatment. And so he's like, you know what, that sounds very good. And so he went to go live with her. He was still going in for his treatments. And, because obviously he went frequently, but one day he stopped coming in for his treatments and eventually the doctors got suspicious of this and didn't know what was going on. And so they called the boarding house looking for him to find out what happened. Dorothea answered and she stated, oh, he moved away. So he won't be back in for his treatments. He moved to Los Angeles, and they accepted that, and nothing was ever heard from him again. He apparently just got up and moved, just like all the other tenants. That's it. He just moved with the tumor. So she continued to get away with this. Another tenant named Vera Martin, she was 61, went missing one day, and it was actually realized she was missing when she didn't call her daughter for her birthday, because every year she would call her daughter on her birthday to wish her a happy birthday. And that is so sad. Her daughter called and was like, I know something's up. Like, my mom didn't call like she normally does. And I'm not sure the story she gave on that one, but again, Vera was never heard from again. She was only there for a short time too. She was actually one of the tenants that was there for the least amount of time. She did have a lot of problems, like health problems. And she wasn't there for very long, so I wonder if that's why. Maybe Dorothea just figured out it was a little too much for her to handle, and she didn't last very long. But of course, she was able to sign over her checks before she went missing. Of course, you know, that's the common theme, is they all manage to sign over their checks before they move, you know. After this was another tenant named Dorothy Miller, and she moved in and died just a few weeks later as well. But after this, she actually called in a carpet cleaner to clean a bad smelling spot of ooze. And so obviously they came in, cleaned it up for her, but the house at this point was smelling awful. During this time, all the tenants that would disappear, she was keeping in a specific room called the death room. And she would keep them there unalive for weeks at a time. And by now the house was smelling putrid. Other tenants were asking questions, and she would say it was dead rats in the walls. It was a sewer backed up. The smell will be gone soon. I mean, obviously she was also trying to do things like getting the carpet clean. She would put down lime salt and other cleaners, hoping to disguise the smell, but it was definitely showing. So it was, I feel like it should have been more evident, but she was starting to pile these bodies up very quickly. During this time, she actually ran into an old friend from her time in prison, and she got out of prison, and Dorothea offered to help her with her checks. Of course, like, hey, like, let me help you get the maximum that you can, and, you know, you can stay with me, of course, and I'll help you get the checks. Well, she helped her get the checks coming in. She put them in Dorothea's name, but right after, she was drugged by Dorothea. And after she was drugged, Dorothea called the probation officer in charge of her case and told him that she was doing the drugs herself and to come get her. So this woman was put back into prison, where she did try to report Dorothea for stealing her checks, because after she was put into prison, then Dorothea continued to sign her checks and get them. And so she tried to report this, and they basically said, we'll do the best we can, but it didn't really go anywhere. So she just got away with that one. Her next victim would be Benjamin Fink, 65, and he was also a drunk, which was obviously something she was not happy about. And he was actually one of the longest tenants that lived there, so he did make it a while, but again, he was a drunk, and one night he had too much to drink, and they got in this really big fight. Everybody heard it, and eventually, you know, she's like, no, like, go upstairs, like, you're done, go. And the next day, he was gone. He disappeared. People asked questions, and she said that he got really mad that night, and he left. He just apparently, supposedly didn't want to handle her, didn't want to be in that kind of environment, and he decided to leave. Which, to be fair, I can see that one happening if you had just gotten in a big altercation, but people bought it and no one looked for Benjamin Fink. Dorothea's next and last victim is Bert Montoya. He was 51, and he had a lot of mental issues, and he was a little bit slower and couldn't take care of himself very well. And so he was actually put into her care. I had actually heard that his mom had been looking for him 15 years up until this point, and she was in her 90s and never stopped looking for him. Unfortunately, when she did end up finding his whereabouts, it was a little too late, and so that is very sad. But he had been staying with Dorothea, and of course she was cashing his checks. He was frequently in touch with his caseworker until one day he wasn't. So his caseworker actually started calling Dorothea and asking where he was. Where has he been? He hasn't been around. I haven't heard from him. And she would always have an excuse like, well, he's out right now. Call back later. So she called back later, and he still was not there. And she always had a reason. Eventually, this caseworker said, hey, like, if I don't hear back from him, I'm gonna call the police. Like, something isn't right. So Dorothy's like, okay, like, you will hear from him later. Just let him know, and you'll hear from him. Well, a little bit later, the caseworker did receive a phone call, but it was not from Bert. It was actually from Bert's brother-in-law, and they stated that they had picked him up from Dorothea's and taken him to live with them, and that he wasn't going to be in the area anymore. Well, the caseworker, thank God, did not buy this. She said, no, this is suspicious. I've never heard of you. It's not going to happen. Like, I'm calling the cops. So finally somebody was like, no, like, this disappearance isn't right. We're calling the cops. And so she called the cops and let them know something suspicious was going on. She hadn't heard from Bert, and they needed to check it out. When police got to Dorothea's house, she basically told them, hey, I was expecting this, and I knew you were going to be coming, and I'm going to tell you the same thing that I told his caseworker. He is no longer here. He was picked up. They said, okay, well, do you mind if we look around a little bit? And she said, sure. So they went, they looked around, they found nothing, and so they thanked her for their time and left. They continued getting more tips coming in, and they went back to her house for a second time. During this time, they did a more thorough search. Again, they found nothing, and they said, okay, like, we'll head out. We haven't found anything. You're more or less good to go. They had talked to some other tenants, all of which who said, oh no, like, we saw Bert just shortly ago. They just saw him yesterday. They all claimed to have seen him, and the cops said, okay, like, all the tenants are saying the same thing, like, they've all seen him. So they decided to make their way out. Well, on their way out, an actually previous tenant tapped them on the shoulder. They turned around, and he hands them a note. The note said, she is making us lie. So he asked to come in and talk to them in private. He got to the police station, and he told them everything that he knew. He said that Dorothea had asked all the tenants to say that they all had seen Montoya, and they all agreed. They might have been that she threatened them. They might have been a little bit scared of her. I mean, at this point, they have to know that all the tenants are disappearing. And so they all kind of went with her plan, and he let them know that he lived under the stairs and would constantly hear thuds going down the stairs every night, and that Dorothea always had different holes dug that would be covered the next day. And he found a lot of that very suspicious and told them to check it out and bring a shovel. And so, of course, the police said, you know what, like, this does sound really weird, like, we are going to go back. So they went back, did another search. They really didn't see anything, but then they did notice the loose soil. So they asked Dorothea, hey, do you mind if we dig some of this up and look around a little more? She actually agreed. She said, yeah, sure. Let me call somebody to help you do this. And, that way you don't have to do it. And, we'll get it done. they said, no, like, it's okay, we're gonna do it. If we mess anything up, we'll put it back how we found it, but we need to do this. She said, okay, yeah, sure. Like, she was completely cool with this. She went along with it, and she even offered to let them use a shovel, one of her shovels, because they only brought two, and they kindly accepted. Yeah, like, we'll take the shovel, thank you. While they were digging, one of the officers ran into what they thought was a tree stump. And so he begins pulling at this part of a tree, or like what he thought was like a limb of a tree, and pulling at it, trying to get through it. And it's not coming loose. He's trying to break it, pull it. Well, he pulls with all his might. Eventually it comes out. And what is in his hand but a leg? It is a human femur. And they found little bits of cloth and everything. Well, of course, this turns into a crime scene right away. He asked Dorothea, like, what is this? And Dorothea walks up to the hole, looks down at this bone, and she says, oh my God, how did that get there? And he says, you tell me. She obviously gives excuses right away and says, I have no idea. I mean, I'm not the only one that's lived here. There was people that lived here before me. There's other people that live here with me. You know, anything could be the case. I have no idea. And so they were like, well, we're going to continue searching. This is now a crime scene. She even asks if she's under arrest. And he says, no, like, you're not currently under arrest, but I do need you to come in and answer some questions. She says, well, I can't come today, but I will come another day. He thinks it's a little suspicious that she's already asking if she's under arrest. And he kind of asks her about that. And she says, well, I'm just really anxious. Like, and this is happening like as they're digging up more and more of the yard. And so she's kind of stopped them to say this. And she says, I'm very, very anxious. Would you mind if I go just down the road to this little cafe and get a cup of coffee just to kind of calm my nerves, and I'll be right back? Well, one of the officers, and he gets a lot of crap for this, and I can see it, but I also don't think it's 100% fair because she was a very good manipulator. She looked like a sweet little old lady, you know. But anyway, he basically says, yeah, okay, like, he drops what he was doing, digging in the yard, and says, I will kind of escort you. And this is where you see, like, her iconic picture of her in the red coat with a pink umbrella. So he watches her go down the road and turn into the inn where the cafe was, and he resumes working. So he did watch her get there and assume that that's what she was doing. And so he continues working, and he was only working for a moment whenever he actually right away runs into more bones. And it is another body. So he calls out, says, hey, we have another body over here. And that is whenever they decide to dig up the entire yard. And of course, right away they say, where's she at? He says, well, she is at the inn cafe just down the road. We'll go get her, of course. So they go to find her. And lo and behold, she is not there. She is gone. She left. Because, you know, that's what she's best at. She runs. So, of course, like what she's done every single time is run, and she ran. She's gone. So they're just left to continue working. Obviously, put out they put out a warning for her arrest so that everyone around could keep an eye out. They put her picture everywhere so that people knew what she looked like. As detectives continued to search Dorothea's yard, they found more and more bodies, and they actually ended up finding a total of 9 bodies, each belonging to one of the people that went missing. And luckily they were able to identify each of these bodies through contacting those whose families knew of them to have resided within the boarding house. And that is when light was shed on exactly what had been happening throughout this time. They found each body in different locations, one under the shed, another near a rose bush. They found one under a gazebo. They found them in different locations. The first one they found was actually Carpenter's body, and that's not even who they originally were looking for. They were looking for Montoya. So obviously that was a shock on just how many there were when they just knew of one that was missing. When they found Vera Martin, they said that her watch was still ticking, which I find that so, it gives me goosebumps, you know? Each body that they found was wrapped in blankets and different materials. The only one that was different was the one they actually found in the front yard, and that was belonging to Betty. Betty is believed to be the first victim that she decided to bury in this way, because none of the others were buried in this kind of way, so it seems like she was trying to be more careful. But Betty, they found her remains, but they were not able to find her hands, her lower legs, or her head. And I'm assuming that Dorothea was trying to make sure that she was never identified. They were still able to identify her, but unfortunately they were never able to find those missing pieces of her body. Each body was found to have had a large amount of a sleeping medication, and although they know that each one did have this drug in their system, they were not able to prove a reason for any of their deaths. The decomposition had just went too far, and so none of them were actually given a cause of death. It is rumored that she strangled a lot of them, that she would drug them to sleep and then strangle them after they were asleep. Other people think that it just built up in their systems over time until it killed them, which would make sense as well, considering that a lot of them were seen to be very tired before or leading up to their disappearance. And it was also found that they would die. She would put them in a room for weeks as they decomposed, and it melted into the floor, and that's when she would wrap them, drag them down the stairs and into one of her pre-made holes. What is a little bit weird is that she was a very small older lady, and especially like Bert. Bert was a very tall, large man, and supposedly she was able to get this man down those stairs by herself and into his hole, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I wouldn't be able to do that very easily with my husband, and he's a very big built man. So how was she able to get a man even bigger than him whenever she was just a small, tiny old lady? And so a lot of people do think that she had an accomplice. However, it's never been proven. They've never found anybody to have accomplished her, or like been her accomplice. So I'm not really sure, but they've never been able to prove it. But a lot of people do suspect that she did have help. Around this time, as the bodies being uncovered hit the news, word got back around to Ruth's family, and of course they said, hey, she was just found to have all these bodies on her property, all having this drug in their system, and our mother clearly was drugged as well. We really need you to reopen this case. As you can see, she has a large history of this now, proven. And so they did actually look into it more, and they did eventually attribute her as having been one of her victims. Although again, obviously nothing can technically have been proven, but they did attribute that, and they did look into it more. During this time, she is in Mexico. And you'd think that she would be laying low, making sure not to be caught. But no, it was further from the truth. She was actually in a bar and trying to go back to her old tricks. And so this is where she met a man, and she drank with him, was trying to talk him up, started asking him about his finances. He thought it was a little weird. They were having a good time. He kind of let it go, but he couldn't get it out of his head that she looked familiar. So when he went back to his house, that is when he turned on the news and realized why she looked familiar. He called the police, and of course they went right away to finally arrest her. And so she was taken into custody. When she was taken into custody, she told the lead detective that she was sorry and that she used to be a good person at one time. However, she never did admit to having hurt anybody, and she would actually, to her grave, deny ever having committed any of these murders. During Dorothea's trial, they had lots of evidence, they had lots of witnesses and that testified against her, but she stuck to the fact that she was innocent. They offered her a way to avoid the death sentence if she just pled guilty, but she refused. She really thought that she would be able to get out of it, and so she continued to plead not guilty. And her defense said that since they weren't able to prove that she killed any of them, they all died of natural causes, and she buried them to hide the fact that she was running an illegal boarding house, which she did admit to that. And so since they weren't able to prove that, not all of the jurors were completely convinced. So when it came time to deliberate, it actually took them 6 months to come to a conclusion, which is the longest in U.S. history. It is a very long for jurors. That is uncommon for jurors to take that long to deliberate. And when they came back, they didn't actually have an answer. All of them thought that she was guilty except for one juror who believed that she was innocent. So the judge told them to go back and deliberate some more. And when they finally did come back, they found her guilty on only 2 of the murder charges. And that is because the one juror was like, well, I'll give you these, but I'm not giving you the others. And so she was only given 2 counts of murder, which I guess she wasn't found guilty of Ruth's murder, and her family, although they weren't very happy about that, they knew that that was going to be enough to put her away for the rest of her life. And so that at least did give them some comfort. When they did decide what her jail time was going to be, it was life in prison without the possibility of parole. While she was in jail, she again was actually very popular. She made tamales in her cell and would give them away, and apparently people just loved her. And at one point, somebody actually got a hold of her to add some of her recipes, including the tamale recipes and a cookie recipe, which is said to be how she poisoned her cakes, how she poisoned her victims. I don't know if that's true. There's one of the rumors. He took those recipes and he put them in a cookbook that is called Cooking with a Serial Killer, and that is still available today. And he published that, and so you can actually find her recipes. She did eventually die in jail of natural causes, and I couldn't find why, just natural causes. The house actually is still up. It has new owners who have since really taken a liking, I guess, to the story. You can search the images. They have done it up with signs like "Stay out from under the line." They have a little figure of Dorothea, or a little mannequin of Dorothea in one of the corners, which to a point I think is a little disrespectful to the deceased, but they say that is their way of accepting it. And it's their house, but it has since been on television shows like Murder House Flip and things like that. So it is still up for you to see. They do have even a QR code if you go to the gate. But with that, that is about all I have for this case. If you stuck around to the end, I thank you. I am working on more of the suggestions for my next video. If you have any other suggestions, feel free to leave me a comment, or if you have any comments on this case as well. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.